Hey guys, back here again with another list for you. Yes, you have me today. Dylan is taking a week off. You guys really put him through the ringer with all those brutal horror films that he had to check out. Plus, he's really getting into whips, chains, the BDSM stuff. So, the whole shebang, I guess. I don't know. I'll keep you updated on that. But this week, I have a little bit lighter subject matter, I guess you would say. 5 obscure films from legendary horror directors. Yes, we're just getting out of the Halloween season. We all watched our usual suspects, Halloween, Friday the 13th, whatever your choice. But I did a little bit of a deep dive, kind of different this week. Usually we pick some of the best for these lists, but I kind of did a couple of blind buys, I guess you would say. So a couple of films I hadn't seen that I decided to check out just because they were pretty obscure in terms of some of these notable horror directors. So, let's get into it. Clawing its way into the number 5 spot is Deadly Blessing. After her husband dies under mysterious circumstances, a widow becomes increasingly paranoid of the neighboring religious community that may have diabolical plans for her. Directed by Wes Craven, the man who made us lose sleep in the 80s, and of course, Afraid to Answer the Phone in the 90s.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Released in 1981, this one feels like a bit of a different outing for Craven. If you're used to some familiar properties like The Hills Have Eyes, Scream, or Nightmare on Elm Street, this was a first-time watch for me, and just from the concept and logline alone, I thought this one looked rather interesting. Looking at Wes Craven's filmography, Deadly Blessing falls after some of the cult hits in the 70s and right before some of his bigger mainstream films like Swamp Thing and his first stop in Springwood. The film finds itself with a much slower pace than most of his films and a really secluded setting, bringing us into the world that will be considered very unfamiliar to its audience. They lean on the whodunit aspects as the presentation is more of a typical POV slasher during moments of horror. While the elements of horror are there, I just feel like there isn't enough to classify this as a pure horror film. A lot of the time is spent with Martha and her friends dealing with this religious Hittite community, but when you become aware that you've been away from the horror elements too long, that's when they decide to inject it. Craven amps up some tension and utilizes those slasher elements to bring you back into the film. There's actually a pretty intense barn scene involving a younger Sharon Stone that is very well done. I just wish there were more scenes like that that could really capitalize on this unique concept, because as you look at it, this unique concept of this secluded community really does open up for a lot of different elements of horror that could really be utilized. It just seems like they spend a lot more time dealing with the politics and the fallout of an incident closer to the beginning of the film rather than really leaning on the horror elements. Also, if you want to see Craven utilize a very famous bathtub scene that serves as a precursor to Nightmare on Elm Street, this one may be worth checking out for you. Stealing its way into the number 4 spot is A Stranger Is Watching. A twisted man holds a TV newswoman and a girl hostage in the bowels of Grand Central Station. We've all had our hearts broken by the volatile situation with Friday the 13th, but if you want to go back to a much happier time when Sean S. Cunningham and Victor Miller weren't at each other's throats, this is a fun stop. And by fun, I mean not at all, because this film is grimy as fuck. But not in the way a Rob Zombie film makes you want to bathe in bleach. Sean S. Cunningham had a way of capturing that early 80s New York feel that would make you want to never see the Statue of Liberty. This was another fresh watch for me, and I wasn't really prepared on how much I was really going to enjoy this film. It has such a personality to it and feels so much different than what Cunningham did with Friday the 13th. This is another slow burn film that really leans on those tense moments, which there are quite a few sprinkled throughout the film. Our antagonist being an adult, it really emphasizes that terror when our 8-year-old protagonist is being pursued. The build-up to the abduction scene was probably one of the biggest standouts of the film for me. Whether you're a parent or just go back to those thoughts of being home alone as a kid, this one can really strike a chord with you. Cunningham makes great usage of making one setting feel bigger than it is and gives us some of the more layered character dynamics when our antagonist goes out in the city to meet other criminals. Seeing a much younger Rip Torn playing this villainous role took a second to warm up to, since he's not teaching us the ins and outs of dodgeball.
What?
But seriously, Rip Torn really does excel in this role. As we go through the beats of the film, we learn that his motivations just get darker and darker. And while it's a subtle performance, it's not overly emotional. He doesn't really have any scenes that you're going to say, wow, he really stole the show here. I think it's adequate enough for us to really dislike this character as we keep going, and it just gets worse and worse. If you like something like The Black Phone, this could be something you might enjoy. While it's not as well made or as in-depth with its character work, A Stranger is Watching has an interesting voice, and Cunningham makes the city feel like such a threat through the lens. And in another timeline, I think this could have been the New York I wanted Jason Voorhees to take. Coming in at the number 3 spot is Toolbox Murders. A historic Hollywood hotel houses a supernatural evil. It's been subdued for decades, but when renovations start, a series of murders take place. This one's directed by Tobe Hooper. Of course, we're all familiar with his horror resume and giving a new dynamic to family dinners. This one was directed in 2004, so a little bit later in Hooper's career. Out of all the films on the list, this one is the one I'm most familiar with. I used to watch this all the time back on television back in the mid-2000s. Every time that it was on, I saw that opening with Sherry Moon Zombie making an appearance. I got super excited. This one is just such a breeze to get through and has a lot of classic moments in it for me. Not revisiting this one in quite some time, I forgot how much fun this film is. It has some of those classic gross out moments that we're so used to seeing Hooper do in his previous works, but might feel a little modest when you're putting this up against something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But let's be honest, a lot of films are at a disadvantage when we're comparing it to that. Using the apartment complex horror subgenre, so to speak, as a device to build tension and horror is another aspect of this film that I absolutely adore. We've seen it used in more modern horror like Evil Dead Rise and even Sting. And just like those, Toolbox Murder uses that element to build some tension and push that horror adequately throughout the film. Hooper is able to inject some of that campy comedy to add some levity to the heaviness of the slasher and supernatural elements of the film, but it finds a happy marriage to produce a remake that feels like it is from Hooper's wheelhouse. And if you're familiar with The Toolbox Murders from the 70s, this is a pretty heavy departure from that property. This is something where Hooper took the film, the concept itself, and really added his creative stamp on here to really make something unique and really warrant a reimagining, remake, whatever you want to call it, so that you can really watch these films as two separate entities. While this isn't a perfect film, it is just so digestible and has that fun sci-fi film feel to it that if you're a fan of those films from the mid-2000s like Monster Man or Abominable, I think this film really does capture that essence well. Hooper is really able to capture the grimy atmosphere of this old apartment complex and mixes that with some abrupt kills throughout the film. I love that the kill scenes happen without much warning, so our brain doesn't really have the time to adjust until it has already taken place. While this may not be an all-time classic from Tobe Hooper, this definitely needs some more love. Taking that number 2 spot is Someone's Watching Me. A woman is being watched in her apartment by a stranger who also calls and torments her. A cat and mouse game begins. Directed by John Carpenter in 1978, he steps away from those Midwestern town vibes of Haddonfield we know so well from Carpenter's biggest hits. This was a made-for-television film that aired on NBC and deals with a single woman in Los Angeles. While this has a different feel landscape-wise from Halloween, a lot of the great traits from that film are evident here as well. Creating one of our greatest final girls with Laurie Strode, we see Lauren Hutton, who plays Lee, as our vessel in the LA city life as she is being harassed by an anonymous stalker. The magic Carpenter was able to create writing a character like Laurie is displayed with Hutton's character Lee as well. Both characters are so likable, but for different reasons. While Laurie is meek but strong-willed, Lee is very outgoing, cracking jokes, and not afraid to make the first move when it comes to male characters. There was a character choice here that absolutely captivated me. In one scene, Lee knows her stalker is actually in the parking deck of her apartment complex. Rather than seeking help, she grabs a knife and goes out to the parking deck and actually goes to confront this anonymous voyeur. leading to a very suspenseful, brief cat and mouse game that I think was so well done and such a pivotal character choice for Lee that makes you really get behind her. The film was heavy in the psychological aspect rather than any guts and gore. I don't think there's really any actual blood shown that I can remember, but Carpenter really leans on that tension aspect, bringing some of those Hitchcock-like elements, keeping the audience on the edge of their seat the whole time. And I keep mentioning Halloween, but I think the comparison to that film and this film being so close together timeline-wise, that it shows how diverse Carpenter is as a storyteller. Creating two different but very likable female protagonists was quite an accomplishment, but approaching that idea of voyeurism in such a different manner as well. One of the most iconic Halloween scenes is Michael watching Laurie, and Laurie knowing Michael is watching. The different approach in Someone's Watching Me is that Lee's in this big city, knowing someone is stalking her, but she looks at this giant apartment complex across the street, and it opens up that dynamic of it could really be anyone. I think that's really where the true terror lies. When you get this giant landscape, this scene of so many different windows that are looking inside Lee's apartment, I think that's where the true terror of this lies. While not being gory or really leaning on those classic slasher elements and just being a different film of its own, I think this film has so many great aspects to it, it really does need to be uncovered by more Carpenter fans. Taking the #1 spot on the list is Killer Joe. When a debt puts a young man's life in danger, he turns to putting a hit out on his evil mother in order to collect the insurance. Directed by William Friedkin, who gave us one of the most iconic horror films in The Exorcist. This one came out in 2011. I actually didn't discover this one until almost a decade later, and I gotta say, what an unexpected treat this was. From the moment it opens, it just has you absolutely hooked from that pacing and performances. Now, the overall concept isn't something that we haven't seen. It's nothing out of the ordinary. We've seen it in quite a few films, actually, but I think what really does hook you here is the cast and the characters that the world is created in, which really makes Killer Joe such a standout from Friedkin. The scary thing about Killer Joe is how grounded it remains, but how off the wall these characters are. But really standing back and looking at the whole picture, coming to the realization that there are people like this in the world that actually exist. Emile Hirsch's performance was not something I was prepared for when I first watched this. Seeing him in things like The Girl Next Door or Prince Avalanche, and then seeing him as this unsavory human being that will sell out his entire family just to get out of trouble that he's in, while somehow digging himself into a deeper hole. While Hirsch and Juno Temple put on some really great performances all around, there's no surprise that Matthew McConaughey steals the show as the title character. He plays such a nasty bastard in this film, and if there's one way I like my McConaughey, it is nasty.
That's what I love about these high school girls, man.
He takes that likable charisma he's had throughout his career and really channels some darker layers here. Killer Joe being a precursor to the first season of True Detective, but you can really see McConaughey really laying that foundation of his Rust character from 2014. Having such a layered performance makes you at times want to like Joe, but as we get deeper into the film itself, McConaughey really lets the chain off, and we get into some really dark and exploitative material with some of the characters in the film. Watching all these characters collide in one instance that has brought them together grabs your attention and doesn't give you time to mentally recalibrate as the world changes and we're finding out new information. By the time you get a moment to start connecting the dots, the world has changed once again. This film is the epitome of Roddy Piper saying, "When you think you have the answers, I change the questions." There are some brutal scenes in here as well that will leave a lasting impression. While the film isn't rooted in the horror space, there are some bloody scenes, especially toward the end. This is such a strong outing for Friedkin, and his pairing with writer Tracy Letts created a unique world with interesting characters that is accentuated by the dialogue that they deliver. Killer Joe is such a hidden gem that if you're going to make time for one film on this list, this has to be it. And there you have it, guys. 5 obscure films from legendary horror directors. A little bit of a mixed bag this week, I would say. Those top 3 films, easy recommends. Certainly those top 2 are must-sees, especially for any horror fan. 4 and 5, not so much. Maybe if you get around to it, or if you're just curious about a Wes Craven and Sean S. Cunningham property, put those on your list. But I gotta say, I had a lot of fun here checking off some boxes, especially with Deadly Blessing and A Stranger Is Watching. I had always heard about those, but never really had an excuse to watch them. So I'm glad I did check them out, even though they didn't necessarily hit for me. So I hope you enjoyed the list. Dylan may be back next week. I don't know, maybe it'll be me. We're still deciding on there, throwing around some ideas for some lists. If you're curious about anything coming up, check out the channel. We certainly have a couple more reviews on deck this coming week, so keep it right there. If you're not already subscribed, please do so if this is your first time on Splattercast. We always keep you updated with some of the latest horror films, so please like, subscribe, share, and until next time, I'm Luke Janesco, and stay scared.
Do the horror shit, gonna do it live, cause Splattercast kick it every day they live. Splattercast, 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 Splattercast,